I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep, knowing exactly what would happen. When the door creaked open, and I heard the quiet shuffle of footsteps on the carpet, I didn't move. My own son, sneaking into my room in the dead of night, reaching for the drawer by my bed, because his wife told him to. But when the sharp snap of the mousetrap cracked through the silence, and Ethan cried out in pain, I finally opened my eyes and asked him, calm as ever, "What exactly were you hoping to find in your mother's room at 2 a.m? That was the moment everything changed. My name is Bethany Wallace, and this is the story of how I quietly took back everything that was stolen from me. I knew the sound before I even opened my eyes, the soft, unmistakable creak of my bedroom door. It was a sound I had learned to ignore over the years. Little things creaking in the night, a draft slipping through the window, the house settling into its bones. But this wasn't that. This was different. It was deliberate. It was sneaky. And it was happening in my own home. I stayed perfectly still, breathing as shallowly as I could, ears straining through the silence. I counted the steps. Careful, measured, socked feet, brushing against the carpet. They thought I was too old, too slow, too oblivious to notice. But they were wrong. The door had been left just slightly ajar on purpose, and so had the nightstand drawer. It wasn't forgetfulness like Madison liked to claim whenever she mocked my memory. It was a setup, a quiet little trap I had crafted over weeks of suspicion and heartache. And now, as the shadow loomed closer, I knew exactly who it was. Ethan, my son. My own flesh and blood. The weight in my chest wasn't fear. It was something heavier. Something bitter. I had raised that boy. I had kissed every scraped knee, cheered at every school recital, stayed up nights during his illnesses, and worked overtime shifts just to get him through college. I had given him everything, and yet here he was, sneaking into his mother's room like a petty thief, pushed by the greedy whispers of a woman who had only been part of this family for a few years. Madison, always smiling, always helpful when others were watching, always ready with a sweet mom on her lips when she needed something. And apparently, now pulling strings behind the scenes, using my son's love and loyalty as weapons against me. She had poisoned his heart, drop by drop, until Ethan could no longer see me as his mother, but as an obstacle. I could hear him breathing now, standing next to the nightstand, fingers fumbling with the drawer handle. He hesitated, perhaps second-guessing himself. But then the click. Just enough space to slip his hand inside, just enough of my staged envelope peeking out to make it irresistible. A few more inches and snap! The sharp crack of metal echoed through the quiet room, followed by a sharp, startled yelp. The kind of noise you'd expect from a child who just realized he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar, except this was no child and there were no cookies. I sat up slowly, purposefully, letting my movements stretch out in the silence. I reached for the bedside lamp, flicked it on, and watched the room flood with yellow light. Ethan was standing there, bent over, cradling his hand where the mousetrap clung stubbornly to his fingers. His face was twisted in both shock and pain. His body frozen like a kid caught red-handed, which in every way that mattered he was. "What the hell, Mom?" His voice was a hiss, but I didn't move, didn't flinch. I just looked him straight in the eye, a steady, unwavering gaze I had perfected over decades of motherhood. "What exactly were you hoping to find in there, Ethan?" My voice was calm, too calm, and I knew that unnerved him more than if I had screamed. He opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by the hurried shuffle of footsteps outside the room. Madison appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, hair, messy from bed, but face already contorting into a well-practiced expression of horror. "What happened?" she gasped, rushing to Ethan's side, taking in the scene. Her husband in the middle of the night in his mother's room, caught by a literal mousetrap. "She set a trap for me," Ethan shouted, holding up his hand, the metal device still clamped to his skin. "Who does that? Who booby-traps their own room?" I didn't blink. I didn't even raise my voice. The kind of person who knows her own child is being used like a pawn, I said softly. The kind of mother who knows when she's being stolen from... The words seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on all of us. I watched Madison's lips part, searching for a defense, searching for one of her carefully rehearsed excuses. But nothing came out. Ethan's face flushed an angry red, but beneath that rage was something else. Confusion, guilt, maybe even shame. I stayed perfectly still, hands resting lightly in my lap, back straight against the headboard. I had learned long ago that sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes the quietest words cut the deepest. I wasn't stealing, Ethan muttered, but it lacked conviction. No. I asked, tilting my head just a little. Then why are you standing here at 2 a.m. rifling through my drawer drawn in by a piece of paper left out, just to see who would take the bait? Madison's mouth opened again, this time sharper, more defensive. Ethan was just checking on you. You've been forgetful, sometimes confused. We were worried, right, honey? She nudged Ethan, who looked more like a cornered animal than a concerned son. I gave a small, humorless smile. Madison. Dear, you underestimate me. I may be older, but I've raised a family, worked 3 jobs at once, balanced a home, and buried a husband I loved more than life. I didn't survive all of that just to be made a fool of by my own children. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the only sound being Ethan's uneven breathing and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath Madison's shifting feet. I could see it then. The cracks forming in the perfect little image Madison had constructed. The veneer was chipping, the mask slipping. And Ethan, my poor, misguided Ethan, was beginning to realize it. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low but firm. I've been watching. I've been listening. And tonight I gestured at the pathetic trap still clinging to my son's hand tonight. I finally have the confirmation I needed. Madison crossed her arms, her stance stiffening. This is ridiculous. We're family. No, I said simply we were family. But when you turned my son into a stranger who would creep into my room in the dead of night, that's when you stopped being family. Neither of them spoke. I could feel the shift happening in real time. Ethan looking down at his injured hand, his mind turning over the quiet betrayal he had participated in. Madison's mouth, twitching eyes darting between me and her husband, realizing her grip wasn't as strong as she believed. I stood up slow but steady, straightening my nightgown, feeling taller than I had in years. Now, I said, walking past them both, it's my turn to decide what happens next. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a burden. I didn't feel powerless. I felt alive, strong, unshakable. I could feel the pages of my story turning, and this time I was the one writing it. 6 months earlier, my life looked very different. I was living alone in a little 2-bedroom house I had shared with my late husband Daniel. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Quiet, familiar, a place filled with decades of memories. Then came the stroke. It was mild, the doctors said. I was lucky, they told me. No major damage, no lasting effects. Just a faint weakness in my left hand, and a lingering reminder that I wasn't as invincible as I had always thought I was. The days following the hospital were filled with calls from Ethan, my only son. His voice was warm, full of concern, layered with guilt for not being there when it happened. Mom, you shouldn't be alone anymore, he said. You'll recover faster if you stay with us. Let us help you. I hesitated, of course. My independence wasn't just a convenience. It was a point of pride. Daniel and I had worked our whole lives to retire in peace, and after he passed, I had held on to that home like an anchor. But now, sitting in a quiet house that suddenly felt too big, too empty, I realized Ethan was probably right. My health had taken a hit, and while my spirit was still strong, my body had proven it could falter without warning. So I agreed. A few days later, Ethan and Madison arrived with bright smiles and promises of care. They packed up a few essentials: clothes, medications, my knitting basket, and framed photos of Daniel. I left behind the house and moved into their guest room. Madison practically beamed as she opened the door for me. "We're so happy to have you here, Mom," she said, all syrup and sugar. "Make yourself at home. You'll see. This will be good for everyone." Ethan, standing behind her, nodded enthusiastically. "You don't need to worry about anything now. We've got you." It sounded nice, comforting even. After Daniel died, there had been days when the loneliness was unbearable. Maybe this would be good. Maybe being surrounded by family, having people around, would soften the harsh edges of grief. I allowed myself to believe it. But I also knew myself. I was never one to sit idle to simply exist in someone else's home without contributing. So I insisted on paying my way. "I'll cover part of the mortgage," I told them. $900 a month. They protested just briefly, but I could see the quick exchange of looks between Ethan and Madison. They didn't push too hard before agreeing. Madison even patted my hand, saying, "Only if it makes you feel better, Bethany. You're family. Money doesn't matter. I also promised to help around the house." Madison had always been busy, juggling her part-time job, 2 young kids, and a house to manage. I could lighten the load. I started packing the kids' lunches every morning, folding the laundry before they got home, wiping down the kitchen counters after every meal. I picked up groceries when needed, made sure there was always dinner on the table, and walked Emma and Lucas to the school bus, on days Madison felt too tired to get up. At first it felt good. I felt useful again, part of something bigger than myself. The house was lively, filled with the noise of grandchildren's laughter, the comfort of family routines. Madison's smile seemed genuine. Ethan hugged me goodnight, and I slept well, knowing I wasn't completely alone anymore. I convinced myself I had made the right choice. Sure, the guest room was smaller than my old bedroom, and I missed my garden, my morning walks around the block, my quiet evenings sipping tea by the window. But those were small sacrifices for the warmth of family, I thought. Those first few weeks were full of pleasant moments, movie nights on the couch, Sunday dinners where I got to make Daniel's favorite roast chicken recipe, afternoons spent helping Emma with her reading assignments while Lucas showed me his clumsy soccer tricks in the backyard. For a little while I believed in the picture-perfect life they painted for me. But as the days turned into weeks, tiny cracks began to show. It started with little things I brushed off as unintentional. Madison would redo the towels I folded, smoothing out corners, and sighing like I was a burden, though her words remained polite. Sometimes she'd roll her eyes when I forgot to load the dishwasher right away, or remind me that she preferred almond milk instead of regular. I told myself it was just adjustment, 2 women learning to share space. I caught myself overcompensating, waking up earlier, finishing more chores, keeping out of the way as much as I could. I wanted to be helpful, not intrusive. I wanted Madison to like me, for Ethan to feel at ease having me there. I didn't want to be the nagging mother-in-law, the stereotype people always joked about. Every night before bed, I would sit by the small window in my room and tell myself, "You're lucky, Bethany. Some women your age are in homes with strangers being forgotten. You're with your family. This is what Daniel would have wanted." But sometimes when I looked into the mirror, I caught a glimpse of someone else staring back at me, someone who was shrinking a little more each day, blending into the background of a life she no longer recognized as her own. And I didn't know it then, but those faint cracks were only the beginning of a much deeper fracture, one I could never have imagined even in my worst nightmares. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I would have had the sense to pack my bags sooner. But no, it was the slow, creeping kind of change, the type you barely notice, until one day you look around and realize the place that was supposed to feel like home now feels like a stranger's house, where you tiptoe around like a guest who's overstayed their welcome. It started with the towels. The first time I had spent my morning folding the laundry while Madison was out running errands, I made sure every shirt was neatly pressed, every towel folded into crisp uniform rectangles, just like Daniel and I used to do at home. Madison came back, glanced at the linen closet, and let out a little laugh. "Oh, Bethany," she said with that sugary tone that was beginning to taste sour. "Why do you fold them like it's a hospital? You know it's just towels." Her smile stretched wide, but her eyes remained flat, uninterested. I forced a smile back, my heart shrinking just a little. Then came the meals. I'd always enjoyed cooking. It was one of the small joys that kept me moving, especially after Daniel passed. The smell of a roast, the rhythm of chopping vegetables, the warmth of a bubbling stew. Those things made a house feel like home. In the first few weeks, Madison and Ethan praised every dish I placed on the table. But then Madison started skipping second helpings, pushing food around her plate, whispering to Ethan when she thought I couldn't hear. "Too salty again," she muttered one Sunday evening, scraping the crispy skin off the roasted chicken I had prepared with care. I stopped getting invited to their movie nights. Before Madison would knock on my door with a bowl of popcorn in hand, encouraging me to join them in the living room. Slowly, those knocks stopped coming. I'd hear the faint sounds of laughter and the hum of the television through my bedroom walls while I sat alone finishing the dishes. Ethan would say goodnight in passing, a peck on the cheek, but his hugs grew looser, his conversations shorter. Then it turned personal. Subtle, but personal. My belongings began disappearing. At first I thought I was simply being forgetful. I had my age to blame, right? The soft blue wool scarf Daniel had gifted me on our last Christmas together vanished from the coat rack. I told myself maybe I had left it at the grocery store. My favorite mug, the one with the little painted lilacs, reappeared in the dishwasher one day, with a deep spiderweb crack running through it. No one seemed to know what happened. Even my medications felt off. My arthritis pills didn't seem to work like before. There was a chalky aftertaste that wasn't there prior. Some mornings I woke up feeling jittery and restless, my heart fluttering in ways it never had. I double-checked the bottles. They had my name, my prescription number, but the color of the pills looked a shade too bright. I tried to mention these things to Ethan once over a quiet breakfast. "Do you think, maybe, someone's been moving my things?" I asked carefully. He barely looked up from his phone. "Mom, don't start getting paranoid, all right? You've been through a lot. Maybe you're just tired. Madison says you've been misplacing things." That was the moment I felt it. The slow, sickening realization that maybe I was no longer being seen as a capable adult, but as someone who needed to be managed. Madison took it a step further. The office door where the family's documents were kept used to be open. I had even helped file their insurance papers once when they were too busy. Now it remained locked during the day sometimes, with hushed conversations leaking through when Madison was on the phone. I wasn't sure what she was hiding, but I knew enough to stop asking questions. The walls of that house, once noisy with grandkids running through the halls, began to feel narrower. I stopped lingering in the kitchen after meals. I spent more time in my small room looking through old photo albums, writing in my journal. Slowly I began documenting everything. The missing scarf, the cracked mug, the odd-tasting pills, the tone of Madison's voice when she spoke to me, the absence of warmth in Ethan's eyes. I bought a plain, spiral-bound notebook from the dollar store and kept it hidden between the folded linen towels. Every time something felt off, I wrote it down. The date, the time, what happened, what was said. It felt strange at first, writing it all out like a detective in my own home. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized I needed proof. Not to convince them, but to remind myself I wasn't imagining things. I knew the signs of manipulation. Daniel and I had raised Ethan better than this. I had sacrificed too much to let someone quietly erase my sense of self. I wasn't going to shout, I wasn't going to cause scenes. I was going to watch, and I was going to remember. And in the quiet corners of that house, while Madison whispered and Ethan shrugged off my concerns, I found my resolve hardening. They thought they were breaking me down, isolating me piece by piece. But what they didn't realize was that I was paying attention. Every overlooked comment, every dismissive glance, every small betrayal, I was collecting them all. I wasn't losing my mind. I was preparing. The notebook became my quiet companion, tucked away between stacks of fresh towels, where no one ever bothered to look. Each day, I scribbled little details. Things that wouldn't make sense to anyone else but to me, they painted a very clear picture. Missing pills, A $50 bill that vanished from my purse after a grocery trip. The silver bracelet passed down from my mother suddenly gone from my jewelry box. One by one, the pages filled up not with anger but with truth. It started with the bracelet. I had worn it every Sunday since I was a girl, a delicate silver band with tiny etchings that reminded me of home. I hadn't worn it since moving in with Ethan and Madison, too afraid it might snag during housework. I knew exactly where it should have been, inside a velvet pouch in the top drawer of my nightstand. But one morning, after a quiet breakfast with the kids, I reached for it and found the pouch empty. I searched through my belongings, even checked my old handbag, but it was gone. I mentioned it during dinner trying to sound casual. Madison didn't miss a beat. "You've been tired lately, Bethany," she said, twirling her fork in her salad. "Are you sure you didn't leave it somewhere strange? You know how things slip through the cracks when we're stressed." She smiled, but there was no kindness behind it. Just a quiet warning laced in false concern. Ethan didn't look up from his phone. I wrote it down. March 12th. Missing bracelet, top drawer, no explanation. A few days later, my pills tasted different. Chalky bitter. The usual relief from my arthritis never came replaced by a jittery restlessness that left me pacing in my room. I counted the pills, checked the label, everything seemed in order. But I knew my own medicine better than anyone. I brought it up to Madison, careful not to sound accusatory. "Are you sure you didn't mix them up with another bottle?" she asked sweetly. "You've been a little off lately. Maybe you took the wrong dose." The insinuation settled into the pit of my stomach like a stone. I nodded quietly, said I'd keep track. That night I dug out the small medication tracker I used to use after my stroke and began recording everything. What I took, when, and how it made me feel. Another page added to the notebook. Then came the cash. I had withdrawn $80 for groceries, tucked the bills carefully behind my ID in my wallet. After shopping, I counted $30 missing. My receipt accounted for $47. I checked pockets, the car, even the kitchen counters. Gone. Madison shrugged. "Maybe you gave the wrong bill at the store." "You've been forgetful lately," she said with a sympathetic pat on my hand that felt more like a shove. Ethan barely listened when I tried to mention any of it. His days were consumed by conference calls, rushing the kids to soccer practice, fixing things around the house. When I caught him between meetings and told him about my missing bracelet, he half listened and said, "Maybe you just misplaced it, Mom. Don't stress yourself out." I realized painfully that I couldn't count on my son. Madison's subtle manipulation worked its way into his brain like a slow drip, turning my worries into nothing more than the ramblings of an aging woman. And maybe that's exactly what they wanted. To make me believe it was all in my head, to make me easier to dismiss, to make me question my own reality. But I knew better. I had raised a child. I had cared for a household. I had buried my husband, survived heartbreak, rebuilt my life from ashes. I wasn't going to let them slowly erase my dignity. So I continued writing. Every odd occurrence, every unkind word dressed as concern, every item that disappeared every time Madison accidentally locked me out of the office or adjusted the thermostat without asking. I wrote it all down with meticulous detail, dates, times, exact phrases. The longer I observed, the clearer the pattern became. Madison wasn't careless. She was calculated, always subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but consistent enough to chip away at my sanity. Ethan wasn't cruel, but he was complicit, too absorbed in his own world to notice how his wife was turning his mother into a shadow of herself. It wasn't just the missing things or the bad pills. It was the way I felt invisible, reduced to a housemaid, my value weighed only by how much I could contribute to their household chores. They had stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as a convenience. Another wallet to help with the mortgage, another pair of hands to pick up after their children. And that was the moment I knew. I couldn't fix this with kindness. I couldn't out-cook, out-clean, or out-love the problem. I couldn't make Madison respect me, and I couldn't force Ethan to open his eyes. I could only protect myself. But I needed proof. Not to start a fight, not to point fingers, but to reclaim my clarity, my dignity. I needed to stop second-guessing myself. So I turned every insult, every theft, every slight into documentation. My notebook became my armor, my quiet rebellion. I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't make scenes. I would simply collect the truth, page by page. And when the time was right, I would leave, not as a broken, discarded woman, but as a survivor who had quietly outsmarted those who tried to reduce her to nothing. For the first time in weeks, as I closed the notebook after yet another entry, I felt something return. A small flicker of strength, of certainty. They thought they were winning. But I had just begun. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just another ordinary day, in a life that had begun to feel anything but my own. I had walked to the local grocery store for a few essentials: milk, eggs, a loaf of bread. The autumn wind had a bit of a bite, and I remembered Daniel used to love days like this, saying it smelled like fresh beginnings. Maybe that's why when I reached the checkout counter and saw the little display of scratch-off lottery tickets, I grabbed one on a whim. A few loose dollars remained in my wallet, and I figured, why not? Just a small, silly indulgence. I scratched it in the car, my fingers stiff in the cold. The numbers aligned in neat rows, and I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But there it was. Clear as day, $4, $800. I stared at the ticket, my breath fogging up the windshield, my heart drumming in my chest. No, it wasn't millions. It wasn't enough to buy a mansion or retire on a beach, but it was enough to matter. Enough to make a decision, enough to remind me that luck could still smile my way. I didn't tell anyone. Not Madison, not Ethan, not even little Emma or Lucas. I tucked the ticket safely into my bra, close to my heart, where no one would dare look. That night, as I sat quietly in my room, the worn edges of the scratch-off between my fingers, I allowed myself the smallest of smiles. This wasn't just a win. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to take back control in a house where I'd been rendered invisible. I knew them well enough by now. Madison's hunger for money cloaked behind fake smiles, Ethan's inattentiveness dulled by the constant buzz of work and domestic distractions. They wouldn't be able to resist the scent of unclaimed cash, especially if they thought I'd been careless enough to leave it unattended. I made my plan carefully, methodically, the way Daniel and I used to map out our vacation routes, down to the last gas station. I couldn't rely on my words. Madison could twist them too easily, Ethan could ignore them too conveniently. But I could lay a trap, and this time it wouldn't just catch a thief's hand, it would expose an entire pattern of betrayal. I went to the office supply store and bought a plain manila envelope. I printed out a blank lottery claim form I found online, scribbled my name across the top in my neatest handwriting, and paperclipped it to a fake receipt from a non-existent lottery office. I stuffed a few sheets of random paperwork inside to give it weight, folded it just so, and attached a yellow sticky note that read, "Claim form. Do not lose." Next, I prepared my nightstand drawer. I left it slightly ajar, just enough to catch the eye of anyone passing by. The envelope lay innocently on top my wallet, half exposed beside it. And nestled underneath it all, hidden just below the surface, sat the real prize of my setup. A standard mousetrap, the kind I had bought months earlier when I thought we had mice in the pantry. I had tested it twice to make sure it was still sharp, still capable of making its point. And finally, the real lottery ticket. The one worth nearly $5,000 I hid where no one would dare search. I slid it under the inner lining of my bra, snug and safe, warmed by my own skin. That evening, the household moved around me as usual. Madison muttered something about her client calls Ethan buried himself in his laptop. The kids argued over screen time. I went about my usual routine, preparing dinner, washing dishes, pretending everything was fine. But inside I felt something I hadn't felt in months. A quiet strength, a certainty that I was reclaiming my narrative. Later that night, after the last light was switched off and the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm, I lay in bed with my eyes open, listening. My fingers brushed the hidden ticket beneath my clothes, feeling its edges steady and real. They thought they had me cornered, thought they could gaslight me into doubting my memory, into thinking I was less than what I had always been. But I had learned. I had adapted. And now it was my turn to be the one steps ahead. I didn't set this trap for revenge. I set it for clarity. For proof. Because for too long I had allowed myself to question my instincts, to swallow my discomfort, to stay quiet while my dignity was chipped away piece by piece. I didn't want a fight. I didn't want yelling or confrontation. I wanted the truth to reveal itself through their own actions. I wanted the silence of undeniable evidence. And I knew without a doubt that Madison wouldn't be able to resist. Neither would Ethan. They had become too comfortable, too sure of my silence, too reliant on my compliance. This time I would be the quiet observer, letting the scene unfold exactly as I anticipated. For the first time since moving in, I fell asleep with a calm heart, knowing the turning point was near. The house had taken pieces of me, but I was about to take them back, piece by piece, quietly, decisively. The sound of soft footsteps came exactly when I expected it, just after 2 a.m. I lay perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. The door creaked open, barely a whisper in the quiet of the house. The faint shuffle of socks gliding across carpet followed a rhythm I had learned to recognize over the past few months. I didn't need to open my eyes to know it was Ethan. My son. My only son. The child I had nursed through fevers, celebrated through graduations, stood at the foot of my bed like a thief, like a stranger. I heard him pause near the nightstand. I imagined his eyes darting to the slightly open drawer, catching the edge of the envelope sticking out just enough to invite temptation. Madison had coached him well. I had overheard the late-night whispers through the thin walls, the comments about how Mom wouldn't even notice, how she never checks her stuff anymore, how it's not stealing if it's for the family. The metallic snap echoed sharply through the stillness, followed by a sharp gasp of pain. My eyes opened slowly, calmly. I reached over and switched on the bedside lamp. Golden light spilled across the room, illuminating Ethan crouched beside my nightstand, one hand cradling the other where the mousetrap clamped down mercilessly on his fingers. His mouth twisted in shock and pain, but the worst damage was written across his eyes. Shame. I sat up, pulling the blanket aside, my back straight, my gaze steady. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I simply asked, "What exactly were you hoping to find in your mother's room in the middle of the night?" Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted between me and the drawer, then to the envelope half hanging from it. Before he could stammer out a weak excuse, another set of footsteps echoed down the hall. Madison burst through the door, her hair tousled in a way that made it clear she'd been awake and waiting. "What happened, Ethan?" she cried, rushing to his side. Her eyes widened as she took in the mousetrap, the envelope, and my calm expression. "Bethany, what did you do?" "What I did," I said evenly, "was set a very clear and very deliberate trap." Ethan winced carefully, unfastening the metal jaws from his fingers. "Mom, this is insane. You're setting traps in your own room to catch the rats that come through when they think no one's watching," I replied. Madison straightened up, her voice laced with false concern. "We thought you were confused. You've been forgetting things, misplacing items. Ethan just wanted to check in on you." I almost laughed at the performance. Instead, I stood up, walked over to the linen cabinet, and pulled out the spiral notebook that had been quietly recording every misdeed in this house. I returned to my bed, flipping open the cover and holding it up. "This," I said, my voice calm but unyielding, "is a complete record of every item that's gone missing since I arrived. Every pill that didn't taste right, every dollar that vanished, every time you told me I must have imagined it." Ethan's jaw tightened. Madison's smile faltered. I set the notebook down and reached under my mattress, pulling out a plain white folder. And this, I continued, contains a few things I think you should both see. I opened the folder, laid out the first photograph. Madison wrapped around a man who was very much not Ethan, standing outside a restaurant 2 towns over. Another photo followed. Madison kissing him on the cheek, laughing oblivious to the camera. Madison's breath hitched. Those are old friends. Don't lie to me, I said sharply, my voice cutting through the room like ice. The grocery store clerk thought I was you. She couldn't wait to tell me all about your little rendezvous. That's how I found out where you went. Lucky coincidence, really? Ethan staggered backward, his hand running through his hair, mouth opening and closing without a sound. I placed the next piece of evidence on the bed, a USB recorder. I put this in the coat closet a few weeks ago, I said. I've heard plenty. Enough to know you've been plotting how to get me out of this house. Or worse. Madison's complexion paled, her lips trembling. You were spying on us. You were stealing from me, manipulating my son, poisoning my pills. You made me doubt my own sanity. I pulled out the final document, a copy of Ethan's will altered without his knowledge signed when I was in the hospital after the stroke. I had acquired the original version from the family attorney, and the discrepancies were glaring. Ethan's hands shook as he grabbed the document, his eyes scanning the lines, his face falling with every word. His voice cracked. Madison. You changed this. Madison's facade crumbled. She spun toward him, her voice sharp and defensive. She's turning you against me. She's twisting everything. I stood taller, feeling no rage, no desire to argue. Just quiet certainty. I'm not turning anyone against anyone. I'm simply laying out the truth. Ethan didn't look at her. He didn't look at me. He just stood there, defeated, broken as son, realizing how blind he had been. Madison turned to storm out, but I had one last card to play. I pulled out a retainer receipt made out to an attorney. Someone Madison was related to, thinking family ties would keep her safe. I smiled thinly. I spoke to your cousin Madison. Turns out even blood won't defend fraud. Madison's face flushed with fury, but the fight was gone from her shoulders. I gathered my documents, pressed them against my chest. You wanted to ransack my drawer, I said softly. Tonight I ransacked your lies. For the first time in months, Ethan looked at me. Not with annoyance, not with indifference, but with a dawning understanding. He had no words, and I didn't need any. I had said enough. The evidence would speak louder than any lecture. I turned off my bedside lamp, leaving them standing in the harsh glow of the hallway light, surrounded by the pieces of their own betrayal. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was right there, plain and inescapable. The next morning, the house felt heavier than it had in months. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, warming the hardwood floors, but it couldn't cut through the thick, suffocating air that lingered after the night's revelations. I stood in the kitchen, pouring myself a quiet cup of coffee, listening to the muffled movements of Ethan and Madison upstairs. There were no apologies, no late-night conversations, no tearful explanations, just the weight of silence pressing down on us all. I didn't say a word to either of them that morning. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been laid bare. The evidence sat neatly packed in a manila folder on the kitchen table where Ethan would find it when he finally came downstairs. Inside were photocopies of the notebook, the pictures, the recordings, and, most importantly, a clean, untouched copy of his will, the way it had been before Madison's interference. I had written a simple letter to Madison. No venom, no accusations, just the facts. A detailed account of her theft, her manipulation, her betrayal, and a clear warning that all of it had been documented and could be shared with the authorities at any moment should she ever attempt to retaliate. I didn't need revenge, I needed freedom, and I was taking it. The last piece I left behind was a signed lease agreement. My name scrawled confidently at the bottom, securing a small one-bedroom apartment across town. Modest, quiet, but entirely mine. I had made the arrangements days earlier after that fateful scratch-off ticket gave me the breathing room I needed. I'd scouted the place on my own, paid the deposit in cash, kept everything to myself. because after years of being an open book, I had learned the power of privacy, of doing things quietly without fanfare, without permission. I packed only what mattered: my photos of Daniel, a few favorite clothes, my knitting basket, my worn recipe cards, the notebook that had kept me sane, and the lottery winnings tucked safely in my handbag. The rest could stay. I no longer needed the clutter of a life spent shrinking myself for others. By 8 o'clock, I had loaded my things into the trunk of a cab. Ethan came down the stairs just in time to see me pulling on my coat, my purse strapped firmly over my shoulder. "Mom, where are you going?" His voice sounded different, thinner, lost. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes with a calm steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. "I'm leaving Ethan," I said softly. "I've stayed too long in a place that no longer feels like home." He blinked rapidly, like the reality was only just settling in. We can fix this." "No," I replied gently. "You'll fix your life, Ethan. You'll fix your marriage or you won't. But I won't be here to cushion your mistakes or carry your burdens anymore." Madison appeared in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes flashing with a familiar mix of anger and entitlement. "So you're just going to leave," she snapped. "Run away after turning this family upside down." I smiled, not with spite, but with peace. "No, Madison. I'm not running. I'm walking away with my dignity intact." Ethan took a step forward, his voice faltering. "But you don't have to go." I shook my head slowly. "I do, sweetheart. Because staying would mean betraying myself. And I've done enough of that. No more explanations, no more justifications." I walked through the front door, head held high, heart lighter than it had been in years. I didn't flinch at Madison's scoff behind me or Ethan's stunned silence. I didn't turn around, not even once. The cab pulled away from the curb, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, and with every passing street I felt layers of exhaustion peeling off my shoulders. My life wasn't ending. It was finally beginning. By the time we arrived at the little apartment complex, the sun was higher in the sky, the day warming into something full of quiet promise. The apartment was simple. A tiny kitchen, a modest living room, a bedroom just big enough for me and my memories. But it was mine. No passive-aggressive comments, no locked doors, no disappearing possessions. Just freedom. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I placed Daniel's photo on the windowsill, brewed a fresh cup of tea, and stood by the window letting the sunlight fall across my face. Madison's fury didn't follow me. Ethan's disappointment couldn't weigh me down. Their home was no longer my prison. My choices, my time, my space. It was all mine again. I had lived too long for others. From this day forward, I was living for myself. The first few weeks in my little apartment were a quiet sort of bliss. No raised voices, no footsteps lingering outside my door in the middle of the night. No backhanded comments disguised as kindness. Just silence. Peace. My days became simple, my routines became my own, but even with the freedom, a certain emptiness crept in. Not sadness, but a soft realization that I wanted more than just quiet. I wanted life again, something that belonged only to me. That's when the idea came to me unexpectedly as I walked past a dusty little storefront with a crooked for lease sign in the window. It sat between a shuttered bakery and a hair salon. Nothing fancy, just a narrow space with wide front windows and enough room in the back for storage. But the moment I pressed my hand to the glass, I saw something else. I saw fresh-cut Bloom's shelves lined with little pots of lavender and rosemary customers, walking in and walking out a little lighter than they had arrived. Root and Bloom. I scribbled in my notebook that night. A name that felt like a quiet promise. To root myself to bloom, despite everything I had endured. The next morning I called the number on the window, negotiated a modest lease, and used part of my lottery winnings to cover the first few months of rent and supplies. I knew it wouldn't make me rich, but that had never been the point. I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing something much harder to earn back my joy. Setting up the shop was the most alive I had felt in years. I painted the walls myself, choosing a soft yellow that reminded me of spring mornings with Daniel. I built the display shelves from second-hand wood I cleaned and polished until it gleamed. I filled the space with color. Sunflowers, tulips, daisies, little succulents that sat in mismatched pots. Every detail was mine to decide, mine to nurture. By the end of the first week, I stood in the middle of Root and Bloom, hands on my hips, chest swelling with quiet pride. This was my place, my rhythm, my healing. And soon people started coming. Curious at first, then returning, bringing their friends. They came for the flowers, but stayed for the warmth, for the soft music playing in the background, for the way the shop felt like a little safe haven from the rush of the world. Some bought bouquets for loved ones, others bought a single flower for themselves. Some came just to sit, to breathe in the calming scent of fresh blooms. That's how I met Edith Brooks. She was in her late 60s, sharp as a tack, with a wide smile and a laugh that bounced off the shop walls. She walked in one Saturday afternoon looking for a simple bunch of wildflowers and left with a steaming cup of herbal tea and a new friend. Edith became my regular visitor, a woman with her own battle scars, her own journey of reclaiming life after being pushed aside by those who once claimed to love her. In her, I found a kindred spirit. We'd sit by the window after closing, sipping tea and swapping stories, not of bitterness, but of resilience, of how we both had learned in very different ways to stop apologizing for existing. Root and Bloom became more than a shop. It became a quiet refuge, a place where women, young and old, could come in, breathe deeply, and feel whole again, even if just for a few minutes. I no longer worried about saying the wrong thing, folding the towels incorrectly, or feeling like a burden. I wasn't anyone's housekeeper here. I wasn't anyone's fallback babysitter or silent wallet. I was Bethany Wallace, proud owner of a tiny flower shop that smelled like hope. Every morning I opened the doors with a fresh sense of purpose. I arranged bouquets, listened to strangers tell me about anniversaries and apologies and birthdays. I helped a nervous teenage boy pick out a corsage for his first prom, watched a young mother brighten at the sight of sunflowers, and smiled as elderly couples chose simple arrangements just because. There was no judgment in those walls, no manipulation, no gaslighting, just color and kindness, quiet smiles and fresh beginnings. And every evening as I flipped the little closed sign on the door and turned off the lights, I walked back to my apartment with tired feet, but a full heart. I had thought freedom was enough, but I was learning that joy was just as important. Root and Bloom wasn't just my business. It was my reclamation. A daily reminder that I could still plant roots in new soil, still bloom after being withered by others' selfishness. This was my life now. Simple. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when I first heard the news. Edith came rushing into Root and Bloom, her cheeks flushed, her phone clutched in one hand like it was a burning coal. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't stop to smell the fresh roses I'd just unpacked. She simply leaned across the counter, eyes wide with urgency. "Did you hear?" she whispered, glancing around, though we were the only ones in the shop. "Your daughter-in-law, Madison Wallace. She's all over the neighborhood board. Fired. There's an investigation. Something about financial fraud at her office." I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I didn't clutch my chest or fall into a chair like some poor, shocked old woman. I simply wiped my hands on a cloth, nodded once, and poured Edith her usual cup of lemon balm tea. I had known deep down that it was only a matter of time. People like Madison always think they're too clever, too untouchable, too good at playing their games. But reality has a way of catching up, especially when deceit becomes a habit, not an accident. Later that day, while I was restocking the shelf of wildflowers, my phone vibrated. A call from Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice steady. "Hello, Ethan." His voice, usually brisk and distracted, was quieter now, slower, heavy with something unfamiliar. Regret, perhaps. "Mom, I didn't know who else to call." I leaned against the counter, letting him speak. He told me everything. How Madison had been escorted out of her office the day before, how the investigation uncovered months of misappropriated funds, how clients had complained, how the company was pursuing legal action. He sounded tired, defeated, like the years of ignorance and avoidance had finally crashed down on him in one brutal wave. I didn't see it coming, he admitted. I guess. I should have listened to you sooner. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't say I told you so, though the words hovered on my tongue. Instead, I let the silence stretch just enough to remind him that choices have consequences, that blindness, willing or otherwise, doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility. He faltered before continuing, his voice softening. I've been thinking, maybe we can, I don't know, start fresh. Maybe you could come home for dinner sometime? The kids miss you. I closed my eyes briefly, picturing that old house, the place that had once felt like home, then slowly morphed into a cage. I thought about the cold dinners eaten alone, the missing trinkets, the accusatory stares, the manipulation that seeped into every room. I thought about Root and Bloom, about the smiles of my customers, the peaceful rhythm of my days, the dignity I had regained. I opened my eyes and replied calmly, I have a home, Ethan. Right here. I'm not going back to that house. His voice cracked. Mom. I didn't know. I didn't see it. No, I agreed softly. You didn't. And now you have to face that. He didn't argue. He didn't try to guilt me. There was only quiet acceptance on the other end of the line, the sound of a man finally confronting the mess he had allowed to fester. Over the following weeks, I heard through Edith and the neighborhood whispers how things continued to unravel. Madison was officially charged with multiple counts of fraud. Her name disappeared from family events. The neighbors stopped asking about her. Ethan. I heard struggled to hold things together, his perfect little world finally stripped of its shiny illusion. He called a few more times. Short calls, sometimes updates about the kids, sometimes silent pauses where neither of us had much to say. I listened, but I didn't offer to help. I didn't offer to come back. My place was no longer in the shadows of their home. My place was here among the flowers, among honest people who didn't see me as a burden, but as someone who mattered. I didn't rejoice in Madison's downfall. I didn't gloat. I didn't tell anyone I had known it would end like this. I simply kept running my shop, brewing my tea, listening to stories of hope and heartbreak from people passing through, because I had learned the quiet power of letting the truth reveal itself without interference. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to make a scene. The truth had done the work for me. And all I had to do was step back, breathe deeply, and watch it all unfold from the safe, peaceful distance I had fought so hard to reclaim. A year passed quietly and beautifully, like the steady unfurling of spring after a long, cruel winter. Root and Bloom grew in ways I had never imagined. It became more than a flower shop. It became a refuge. People came for the blooms, yes, but they stayed for the peace. They stayed because within these walls they weren't judged, they weren't criticized, they weren't overlooked. They stayed because they found comfort in the simplicity of kindness, say. I watched people bloom alongside the flowers. Widows came in and left with smiles after arranging little bouquets for themselves. Young women dropped by after stressful workdays, breathing in the soothing scent of lavender. Children stopped after school, pressing their noses against the glass, pointing at the colorful displays. Even men hesitant at first wandered in to buy a single rose, a houseplant, or simply sit for a quiet chat. My little shop became a sanctuary for souls, a place where the broken came to remember they were whole. And I found myself too. I found joy in the quiet mornings when I opened the shutters and let the golden sunlight pour in. I found pride in every satisfied smile, every whispered thank you. I found laughter again, real and unforced, especially on afternoons spent with Edith, who had become not just a friend, but the sister I'd never had. Ethan came by sometimes. Not often, but enough. He walked through the door looking like a man who had been forced to look in the mirror and didn't quite like what stared back at him. The first few visits were awkward. Short conversations, hesitant questions. He brought small gifts. Books for the grandchildren. A new kettle for me, once a packet of seeds he thought might do well in the back garden. I never asked about Madison. He never offered much. She was no longer part of my world, and I had no desire to drag her shadow into this new life I had built. Ethan changed. Slowly, painfully, but he changed. His visits stretched longer. He listened more. He didn't come to take or to guilt or to shift blame. He came simply to be there in the quiet comfort of root and bloom, perhaps learning a little about the peace I had chosen for myself. I didn't let him back in easily. I had learned after all the importance of boundaries, of choosing myself first. I welcomed his visits but didn't rearrange my life around them. I listened but didn't carry his burdens. I smiled but I never forgot. Forgiveness was possible, but forgetting was not necessary. I had built a life that belonged solely to me after years of being told I owed my life to others. One sunny afternoon, I stood in the back garden of Root and Bloom, watching the wind dance through the tall stalks of sunflowers. The rosemary bush filled the corners with soft green. The lavender nodded gently along the path. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the earth beneath my feet, the warmth of the sun on my shoulders. I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally wonderfully free. I had not destroyed anyone. I had not shouted or raged or sought revenge. I had simply removed myself from where I wasn't valued, from people who took more than they gave, from a life that demanded my silence and obedience. I chose me. And in choosing myself, I found something no one had been able to give me for years: peace, dignity, and the quiet, lasting joy of a life lived on my own terms. There was a time when I thought freedom came from being accepted, from being needed, from being part of a family, no matter how broken. But standing there, surrounded by the blooms I had nurtured with my own hands, I realized the greatest freedom came from learning to love myself enough to walk away. Not out of bitterness, not out of spite, but out of respect for my own soul. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the petals, I smiled to myself and whispered, This is what healing feels like. If you've ever felt taken for granted, if you've ever sacrificed for your family only to be forgotten, then maybe you understand Bethany's quiet strength. Have you ever reached a point where you realized choosing yourself was the only way forward? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Wow, your voice matters here. Let's build a space where no one feels invisible again. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story of resilience and dignity. See you in the next chapter.